You know that thought-terminating cliche we often hear in New Age? Things are happening for me, not to me. This narrative epitomizes the main character syndrome. When we look at the world through this mindset of everything is happening for me, we interpret events and experiences as feedback about what it means about ourselves. So when good things happen, we take this as positive feedback. But what about when bad things happen? Especially things that are out of our control. Besides assuming a very narcissistic kind of worldview where you literally think everything has to do with you, this is actually quite self-defeating because it assumes that events in your life have to have some kind of grand purpose to the master plot for your life to matter. And it feeds into this idea that your suffering and your pain is your purpose. Turn your pain into purpose, right? Another thought-terminating cliche. And who profits off our pain the most? The self-help industry. But here's the catch. Rather than profiting off your pain directly, the self-help industry manipulates us to believe that unless we profit off our own pain, then our story does not matter, or that our life does not have purpose. In this way, we commodify our own self-worth by relying on external gains. Having a successful online coaching business, lots of followers. We rely on these external gains to validate our purpose. And as such, we exploit ourselves. And that's how the cult of capitalist self-help works through our consciousness. This is why I call it a mind disease. Welcome to Conscious Revolution, a podcast about political awakening. My name is Margaret Daftian, and I'm here to help you navigate a confusing world of misinformation, hidden agendas, AI, and cult dynamics. Because it's not enough to just evolve, we must also resist and challenge those destructive influences that distort our evolution. Get in, loser! We're starting a conscious revolution. Hello, and welcome back to Conscious Revolution. This is part 2 of the cult of self-help. This is how self-help doesn't help you. In this episode, I'm going to explore and deconstruct the main character syndrome because it plays such a central role in how we relate to self-help in a way that stagnates and jeopardizes our growth and well-being. So if you haven't listened to the first part of this series, I highly recommend that you do. This is where I set the context for deconstructing the self-help industry. And a quick recap of the first part. I talked about how self-help is largely based on pop psychology, which borrows concepts from psychological theories and practices to oversimplify, misrepresent, or distort complex psychological theories for entertainment or mass consumption. I talked about self-help as capitalist propaganda and how the themes of late capitalism and religious fundamentalism and patriarchy converge at the self-help industry, which really hinges on the idea that hard work and material wealth are the ultimate drivers of happiness and well-being, which of course is just a form of collective gaslighting and manipulation to keep working class people exploited through labor while they await these big results or these big rewards without questioning exploitative practices. I explored toxic individualism and how it shows up in self-help and creates a cycle of dependency by keeping people focused on our shortcomings so that we can continue to buy and consume self-help products and services. I call this the self-help cycle of doom, or the self-hell cycle of doom, rather. Okay, and so I also mentioned a few culty aspects of self-help that are related to toxic individualism. The three most salient ones are this zealous, almost religious devotion to personal success. Number two, a disregard for systemic or external factors. And number three, this internalized guilt and blame for personal failures. And lastly, I wrapped up the episode with the idea of ethical self-help, how we can actually embrace a more authentic and grounded approach to self-help. And I gave some tips and recommendations for that. Before we dive right into today's topic, I did want to clarify one thing. I got some feedback on my last episode by my mom. Thanks, Mom. Where she misunderstood an important point that I was trying to make, because that's what moms do. They misunderstand you. No, I'm totally kidding. This was actually a really great point, and I feel compelled to clarify any misunderstandings because I would hate for anybody to walk away without having the insight that the main takeaway from this. I did edit this piece in later, but if you listened to the last episode within the first 24 hours of me launching it, then I definitely want you to hear this. So when I was talking about the study where they looked at the quality of life between people who rated themselves at two different time points at the 10-year mark. So they asked people about how much they think that their personality or their quality of life will change in 10 years. And they found that those people who didn't think that their quality of life or their personality would change very much actually ended up reporting to be happier and have more well-being and quality of life than those who thought that they were going to change a lot. And when I was interpreting these results, I said that your quality of life is not going to change in the next 10 years. And my mom understood that as your life is not going to change in the next 10 years. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I said your quality of life, because that makes a difference, right? It's your quality of life and your life are very different. Your life can change, but the quality of your life is a very subjective experience. And I was like, did I say your life? And then I went and I heard it. And sure enough, I said your quality of life. But I didn't really go into the study and I didn't explore that because I kind of assumed that whoever listens to my podcast is following me on Instagram where I discussed this study, but of course that's not the case at all, so that was totally my bad. It is really important, that piece of it, actually, that's the most important piece of it, is that your life can change. Anything can happen, but your quality of life is not going to drastically change over the next 10 years, which means that you might as well start living your best life now, or at least feeling like you're living your best life. Because if you think that your life is going to drastically change, is probably going to set you up for disappointment, and it's just better to manage your expectations. Assume that in the next 10 years, your quality of life is going to be exactly the same as it is right now, and just decide that you're going to make the best of it anyway. And I bet you anything, that mindset will probably contribute to a really great quality of life, because what they found was that those people who didn't think that they would change, ironically and paradoxically, were more likely to take small actions in their day, just investing or taking care of their health, than those people who thought that they wouldn't change. It's paradoxical. It's a little counterintuitive, but it does make sense when you think about this idea of this illusion that we have that we need to constantly improve ourselves, constantly improve our life. And once we achieve X, Y, and Z, which again is a cult of capitalism thing, because we're conditioned to think that external rewards are the pinnacle of our well-being. But if we really divest from that, and again, it's so challenging to do that because our society and our conditioning is just not set up for that. But once we start to disentangle from that, then we can realize that actually happiness and well-being is not conditional on anything. You can just be well and have joy and fulfillment in your life right now. And that, I think what happens probably is that it relieves so much anxiety that we just start, organically taking care of ourselves and doing things for ourselves and valuing our lives differently. It's more meaningful in that sense because you don't have to work so hard to be happy. You can just be happy. And that is such an empowering message. It is so relieving to get to that point within my own journey and then see it being validated in science, through science, because I knew it. I knew that this constant self-improvement fixation is not contributing to our quality of life. And it was just validated to me. So I've been talking about this. It's it's pretty groundbreaking because, they followed people over 10 years. Sorry, they didn't follow them over 10 years, but they did interview them at 2 different time points, and it was like 5,000 people. So it says a lot. It says a lot, challenges a lot of what we hear in self-improvement about this constant work and this idea that once we achieve this goal, this self-improvement goal, we're going to have a better quality of life. We might have a better life, definitely we will have a better life. 10 years, of course. And that's what my mom was saying. She was like, do you know where I was 10 years ago in my life? If I heard that message that my life is not going to change in 10 years, it would have been so discouraging for me. How could you say that to people? She's really looking out for you guys. So, but yeah, she's right. Of course, our life is going to change. And we have to assume that our life is going to change for the better. Otherwise, what's the point? We would just die. But the quality of our life, our subjective experience of it, our well-being around it, that's not conditional on anything. That's available right now. And these self-help gurus, they teach that. But the difference is they charge thousands of dollars for it. And I just told you that on a podcast for free because I just interpreted some results from a scientific study that I validated through my own experience. You're welcome. Between last episode and this episode, I just want to mention that I did release a blog post where I focused more on self-love and the actual psychological dimensions of self-love. And also how self-love becomes code for narcissism when the ego takes the driver's seat and engages in these pseudo self-love behaviors as yet another personal development goal. And I talked about the self-love paradox, which is how these behaviors disguised as self-love are actually hurting us and harming our relationships, and how all of this contributes to the 2 epidemics that define our era, narcissism and loneliness. So this was focused on self-love, but of course, a lot of these themes are so common across various topics that we explore within the self-help industry. Okay, this episode is about the main character syndrome. And what's really funny is that a couple of days ago, I was lurking on one of these influencers that I follow who I think is just such an epitome of the main character syndrome. And I've always thought that about her. And funny enough, the other day she posted a story where she listed all of the upcoming podcasts that she has. She has a very popular podcast called The Highest Self Podcast. This is Sahara Rose I'm talking about. And one of her episodes is called Main Character Energy. Come on. It's What a validation for me, because yes, she embodies the main character energy. And of course, it's not just her. This is a symptom of our generation, particularly millennials, because of how brainwashed we were by social media and the self-esteem movement. This is more context that I'm not going to cover in this episode, but I talk about the self-esteem craze and how it contributed to the main character syndrome in my Demystifying Self-Love ebook. So I'm covering this topic obviously on different platforms through different perspectives, but they all point to the same thing, which is this dire need that we have right now to start rethinking that framework that places our self-actualization and our personal success as the pinnacle of human potential. So I'm obviously very passionate about this, and I'm going through great lengths to cover it across different multimedia platforms and various topics, because I take this narcissism and loneliness epidemics very seriously. It actually keeps me up at night, because where we're headed as a society is just, it's not the reality that any of us signed up for. And my mind just gets so blown when I see these influencers like totally living their life in their bubble, and they don't see it, or they see it but they don't care, or they're just so caught up in all of it themselves that I actually see them as victims of this system that keeps us on a fucking hamster wheel, looping of capitalism to individualism to narcissism to loneliness back to capitalism. And it's like, where are we going, guys? What are we doing? Like, can you be so fucking serious? We're headed towards our own self-destruction. And then I feel so gaslit, because then I see them like not caring, and I'm like, maybe it's not that bad. And I'm like, well, if they're just living their lives, peacefully, just la la la, ignoring everything, maybe I should too. And I try that for a couple of days, but no, I mean, reality kicks in. I know what the fuck is going on. I'm aware of the world, and I get right back into just, this rant mode, which is good because it also fuels my passion to fucking talk about it. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the main character syndrome. I'm laughing because I totally have main character syndrome. Of course I do. I'm a millennial and I'm like addicted to social media. Obviously, I have main character syndrome. It's not something that you can just escape because it is so deeply part of our social conditioning, but you can be aware of it, and that awareness itself will at least not let it have a destructive social influence on your life, which thankfully I'm at a point where it doesn't, because I don't internalize these toxic messages anymore. What's really insidious about this is that on one hand, the self-help industry promotes and encourages main character syndrome and celebrates it as this quality of self-empowerment through euphemisms like main character energy. And at the same time, it doesn't allow any space or discussion or awareness around the shadow aspect of it, even though these influencers claim to have integrated their shadow. That there's just such a lack of collective awareness and discussion around that what it does is just severs you off from this shadow quality. And when that happens, we internalize it as shame, which then just keeps us hooked and locked into this cycle. And that's how it just fucking perpetuates itself like a disease. It's a mind disease. It is straight up a form of mind control that is like a pyramid of thought. And how do we liberate ourselves from the thought pyramid? Knowledge, awareness, and advocacy, which is what I'm attempting to do through these multimedia platforms where I'm just really hammering away at this topic from multiple angles. It's such an important thing to be aware of, and it's going to contribute so much to your growth and well-being, and simultaneously the well-being of the collective, because once we can disentangle ourselves from this feeding frenzy, we can actually maybe liberate others just through talking about it. Literally one of the best compliments that I can ever receive, which I do time and time again, and it just, oh my gosh, it makes me so happy when people tell me that, because I always say, once you see it, you can't unsee it. When they tell me that now they can't unsee it and they are feeling so much more liberated to be on the other side of it, it just gives me chills, and it honestly makes me so emotional because I suffered through this for so many years. I feel really good about the fact that I can help people liberate themselves from this cult of toxic self-help capitalist propaganda, instead of teaching them how to build a 7-figure business and become an ambassador of it. All right, enough ranting. Let's get down to today's topic. So what is the main character syndrome? This refers to a phenomena where individuals perceive themselves as the central figure in their own life story, similar to how the main character in a fictional narrative drives the plot and experiences significant growth and challenges. It's like the hero's journey. This concept suggests that some people exhibit a tendency to view their experiences and emotions and actions as exceptionally important or unique, which leads to a self-centered perspective on the world around them. Of course, this is not a real syndrome. It is more of a colloquial concept in pop culture to describe a certain mindset or behavior pattern. Of course, like everything, main character syndrome has a dark, a shadow, and a light quality. So we actually do need this main character syndrome for a healthy sense of self-importance that is important for our well-being. It is important for having a strong sense of identity, which is the foundation for healthy self-esteem. Feeling like the main character can boost confidence and resilience, especially when navigating significant life changes, whether positive or negative. It's a big motivation factor that helps us pursue our goals and dreams and overcome obstacles. So it in and of itself, it's not a problem, because underlying that is simply a human bias. And I talk about this, that our biases are not inherently good or bad. It's our lack of awareness of how our biases are distorting our worldview that trips us up. So the problem with it is usually having to do with whether or not we have a healthy ego development. Because when you pursue anything through or any kind of psychological experience through a fragile ego, it easily becomes narcissistic and leads to negative consequences. And the self-help industry encourages this because of this obsessive and excessive focus on the self. The self-help industry exploits our egocentricity bias through these self-centered messages, which makes us over-rely on the bias to where it becomes a blind spot. And anytime we over-rely on the ego, we stay stuck and emotionally stagnant. So egocentricity bias is the underbelly of main character syndrome because we fixate on our own perspective and we see ourselves at the center of everything, where we're both the cause and the target of everything that happens in our lives. You know that thought terminating cliche we often hear in New Age? Things are happening for me, not to me. This narrative epitomizes the main character syndrome. When we look at the world through this mindset of everything is happening for me, we interpret events and experiences as feedback about what it means about ourselves. So when good things happen, we take this as positive feedback. But what about when bad things happen, especially things that are out of our control? We internalize that as guilt and shame. Besides assuming a very narcissistic kind of worldview where you literally think everything has to do with you, this is actually quite self-defeating because it assumes that events in your life have to have some kind of grand purpose to the master plot for your life to matter. And it feeds into this idea that your suffering and your pain is your purpose. Turn your pain into purpose, right? Another thought terminating cliche. And who profits off our pain the most? The self-help industry. But here's the catch. Rather than profiting off your pain directly, the self-help industry manipulates us to believe that unless we profit off our own pain by, spinning our story into a clever sales pitch, then our story does not matter, or that our life does not have purpose. In this way, we commodify our own self-worth by relying on external gains, like writing a best-selling novel, having a successful online coaching business, lots of followers. We rely on these external gains to validate our purpose. And as such, we exploit ourselves. And that's how the cult of capitalist self-help works through our consciousness. This is why I call it a mind disease. And look, if you choose to create a story or meaning out of your experiences, it's obviously fine. It's your prerogative. And in fact, a healthy amount of this is encouraged. It helps us get through very challenging times when we can find some higher meaning and purpose to it. So it's not that the experiences in your life are meaningful because they have an inherent purpose. They're meaningful because they're meaningful to you. And that's enough. It doesn't need to be any more than that. I hold the belief, which comes from non-dual philosophy of emptiness and a little bit of existential nihilism, that events and experiences don't have inherent meaning. And at first, this idea can feel jarring for the ego because it has this incessant need to center itself due to the egocentricity bias. But it's actually quite liberating. And I'll talk about this towards the end. But your pain does not need to be turned into a life-defining purpose for it to matter and have meaning. You can give it meaning, and that it's so powerful. It is such an empowering attitude to have. You really embrace free will in this way because free will itself does not exist, but it can feel so out of control that once you adopt this idea that I have the power in me to attribute meaning to this or not, that is inner freedom. Because the reality is, our pain is simply a part of the human experience, okay? It's really nothing special about that. It's just a part of being human. But for the main character, who is constantly trying to find meaning in every situation, it's a kind of self-imposed hell. I'm going to tell you that. I went through it, and I'll tell you my story about it in a moment. This can lead to constantly thinking that everything has to do with you, can lead to so much anxiety and frustration because we have this pressure to, constantly derive a purpose from every experience. So we overanalyze every situation, we overinterpret things, and if you have anxiety or any kind of symptomatic OCD, this is going to trigger it and make it so exhausting. Really, it's a prison in your own mind. And it just leads to unnecessary guilt and shame, because when you don't feel like your life has this grand purpose because you don't have those external validation factors, it can really cause a lot of low self-worth, which is a very big tenet of capitalism. I was going to say of narcissism, right? Because the narcissistic ego is very fragile, and it's just a breeding ground for shame, and it's a way to get you to buy more things, buy more self-help books, buy more products and services, and that is the self-help cycle of doom. Another big topic here is learned selfishness, which is the survival mechanism that we've sort of defaulted into in this hyper-competitive dog-eat-dog society. Selfishness has really just become a survival strategy. That's kind of how I look at it, because otherwise I don't see why anyone would contribute so much to their own self-destruction if they weren't just trying to survive. So this is where we, prioritize our own needs, goals, and interests above others to secure our position in the system of intereating. And cooperation, collaboration takes a backseat, where self-preservation is really the only goal. And in this society that does prioritize competition and toxic individualism, people are more likely to internalize such values as individualism, which only reinforces learned selfishness. In my opinion, humans are not hardwired to be selfish. This is, of course, up for philosophical debate. Some might disagree with me. But I think that we are really wired to be social creatures, because the truth is we need each other to survive. And if you think about it, those first few years of life, you're completely dependent on caregivers for survival. So we are wired for connection, not competition. Again, this is just my personal opinion rather. So individuals with main character syndrome, they perceive themselves as the protagonist in this highly competitive life story, where success and personal advancement, personal success, are literally paramount for survival. And of course, society plays a role in this, in both the development of learned selfishness and main character syndrome, because like I said, we romanticize it and we really pedestalize it. We create a story around the main character syndrome, and we're pretty delulu about it. And this emphasis on personal success, it just glorifies selfishness and self-centeredness. But at the same time, it says, no, self-love is not selfish, self-care is not selfish. All of these shadow aspects of it are conveniently ignored and denied. And what happens when you glorify self-centeredness within yourself and you are completely detached from the shadow aspects of it? How does that impact us on our well-being? Well, from my experience and what I've seen and observed, it leads to perfectionism, things like imposter syndrome, overconfidence, which is very, very close to a fragile self-esteem. and hyper-competitiveness, where it doesn't feel like enough. If you're not competing with the next person, you're competing with yourself and a past version of yourself. Someone recently asked me how narcissistic self-love can manifest in social media influencers who wax about self-care and self-empowerment, blah, 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 but they don't acknowledge the privileged positions they are in to, allow for these self-empowered choices that they're making and promoting and selling. Well, it manifests through the main character syndrome, through the egocentricity bias that, again, it over-relies on our own perspective when it comes to events in our life. So everything good that happens is because of us and our doing, and anything bad that happens is outside of our control. And it doesn't consider things like privilege and status. It thinks that those aspects are entitled. And what impact does this have on our relationships? Well, you see other people as they serve you. The world is your stage, right? Everyone is just like a supporting role. Everyone's a peripheral role and extra in your story, very eat, pray, love-esque. And it leads to very superficial relationships, superficial connections with others, because the ego is using all its energy and attention and resources to focus on itself. And this, inadvertently is going to lead to a lack of empathy because you're just so disconnected. The first time I realized that I had main character syndrome, which I didn't even identify it as that because it was literally just a thought that crossed my mind and it jolted me into awareness. It was such a big wake-up call, and that's when I just started to relate to myself differently and go through this process of untangling and deprogramming. It was when my grandfather passed away, and the first thing that I thought upon hearing that my grandfather had passed away was, how is this going to fit into my narrative? How am I going to spin this into I didn't use the word spin this, but how am I going to talk about this on social media? Man, I was so deeply disturbed by that thought because, I didn't even pay attention to it. I was in shock, right? Like, naturally, anybody would be. I was in shock. I noticed the thought and I was like, ugh, that doesn't feel good. And I ignored it just to deal with the situation at hand. But it didn't leave me. And it haunted me for months and months and months. I journaled about it a bunch. I reflected on it deeply. And over time, I noticed that my relationship with myself was changing and with others when I made it a spiritual practice to decenter myself. And this has nothing to do with invalidating myself. It's more about just being open to the idea that people have all sorts of experiences and I'm not any more or less special, and people don't exist as peripheral to my story. Everyone has their own struggles and their own way of dealing with it. And so it made me a lot more empathetic and a lot less judgmental. And I stopped judging myself as well because I realized that I'm not here for any majestic purpose. I can just live my life. I can just stop obsessing over my self-improvement and just live and take things as they come without always trying to ascribe some kind of higher meaning to it, right? This is really a barrier to personal growth. The reason why it's so difficult to untangle, for the ego to untangle itself from the main character syndrome, is because there is, on the other side of that, a sense of responsibility and accountability that you have for your actions and the impact that they have on others. And that's why these self-help gurus and these scamfluencers have no qualms about scamming people, because they only see themselves in all of it. They can't see the other person. They can't realize their impact, because all of their energy and their attention and their resources are going towards the ego to maintain its main character status, to make sure that it is still front and center on that stage. And these are the same people who will talk about their ego death and their multiple ego deaths. It's like, give me a break. I'll believe it when I see it. And I'll see it only when you stop fucking scamming, taking advantage, and exploiting people and recruiting them into the cult of capitalism. How about that for an ego death? I mean, how much growth is there in that? How much can you learn from somebody who is so wrapped up in their main character? I just don't see how that person can actually be a authentic teacher, because they are just one big ego projection, and the people who resonate with their message and feel seen by them are also ego projecting. So it's just like a bunch of egos projecting each other and feeding off each other. That's why it's a fucking cannibalistic feeding frenzy. And when these egos are being projected everywhere, there is another thing that happens that is super insidious that no one ever talks about. Well, there's two things, actually. The first one is a parasocial relationship. I've introduced this concept last year because the coaching industry is literally a breeding ground for parasocial relationships. This is a one-sided emotional connection that we develop for a celebrity or an influencer or media personality, where we feel a sense of closeness to them, like they're familiar, and we form this attachment to them, but there is no reciprocal interaction or like a real life connection. So it obviously is a very superficial attachment. But there's another side of this, and it's on the side of the influencer. So what happens to the influencer when they are caught in this parasocial interaction? It's this phenomena called audience capture. And this is when the influencer becomes so engrossed, so captivated by their audience, that they become overly receptive to that relationship or to that type of feedback that they receive, to where it significantly shapes their behavior, their beliefs, their identity. And you can see how this is related to the main character syndrome, because you're now just so entrapped in that narrative, in that persona, in that story, that you literally lose yourself. And this is obviously a very gradual process that happens over years and years and years, very similar to how you adopt a cult identity. And I've literally been through all of that, both as an influencer online and as someone who adopted an actual cult identity. And there's almost no difference. The only difference is that you're just changing your name in the cult. So obviously that takes it one step further. But the psychological process is very similar. It's this redefining and refining of your identity based on the feedback that you receive from your environment, which we all do this, right? This is how we form our identity. So there's nothing inherently insidious about that. But usually we form our identities around feedback that we receive from people who know us, who trust us, who love us and want the best for us. With audience capture, these people, it becomes this collective cloud not a collective cloud, a collective crowd, where these people don't know us personally, right? And they just project an image of what they think we are like based on what we want them to think. And then we reimagine ourselves through their perception of us. So it becomes kind of like a feedback loop. And it's just a performance. The main character adopts this persona based on and through the reimagination of a role that they're playing. And in order to keep up with this role, it mandates that you surround yourself with people who can validate your self-perception. And so those people in the periphery of your stage exist to validate you and to reinforce your persona. And when they stop doing that, when the people around you, your friends, your family, stop validating your persona, guess what happens? Similar to the same thing that happens in a cult. You feel misunderstood, like your friends and family just don't get you, and you cut off your social ties with them. So this online persona, this curated identity, now becomes an extension of yourself. And in order to fulfill the expectations that come with that, the big incentive there is to monetize every aspect of your life and to commodify this persona. To make sure that your online career is sustainable, because literally your entire reality is now shaped around this persona. So, of course, everything that happens in your life is for you to maintain a persona that you can turn into your profit. And I think some influencers, some of these gurus are clever when it comes to this. Like, their online persona is their persona. They know it's their business. They know it's turning profit. So they just keep maintaining that image while they keep their private life separate. Very rarely this happens. And it's impossible to tell because we don't actually know these people. So we can only speculate and just observe. And from my observation, I would say that somebody like Gabrielle Bernstein is very clever when it comes to this. I don't think that she buys into her online manifestation guru persona. I really don't. I don't know why. I've just been observing her for a very long time. It's just an intuitive feeling that I have that she's actually very intentional in the way that she curates her online persona and makes profit off of it. But her private life is her private life, and we don't know anything about it, even though she loves to spin every single depressive episode, life event into a story, into some kind of narrative that we can buy into and build trust. I don't think that she herself is caught in the persona. Maybe a little bit. I mean, you have to be in order to carry on. Otherwise, there's going to be such a huge disconnect between who you think you are and who you actually are. But like I said, some of these scammers are very professional at what they do. Then there's somebody like Sahara Rose, who is a little bit of an enigma when it comes to this. Again, I've been observing them. Like, when I talk about people, it's because I've been observing them for a long time, like at least 4 or 5 years, a long time. Same with Manifestation Babe. I can speak confidently on it because I've gone through an entire trajectory where I've literally been watching their story. Somebody like Sahara Rose, I watched her go from a influencer who was, maybe she had those boundaries up in the beginning of her online persona and then her like real life, And I watched it just become like one big blur. And the reason why I know that is because of the way that she has been talking about her relationship. So she recently got a divorce, and I'm not here to talk about anybody's marriage. It's literally none of my business. Marriages, oh my gosh, relationships are just so complex. We will never know the intricacies of somebody's marriage. However, I saw this bitch monetize her marriage, her wedding, and use this like fairy tale beautiful narrative about how she manifested her dream man. She had written this list down of all the qualities that she's looking for, and then shortly thereafter her friend called her and said, hey, come to this party with me. And she was like not feeling it. It wasn't really the type of event that she would normally go to, but she got this nudge from her intuition to go, and boom, of course she meets her dream man at this party, at this rave or whatever. And she just like made it into this fairy tale story. And then the wedding was monetized, was commodified for profit. She was like selling her wedding album photos. She had this other program that she was doing at the time around relationships. Like literally she built a community of people who were obsessed with her wedding, which was so weird and creepy for me at the time. And I was like, you know what? I'm happy for her. She's in a loving relationship. Great. Lo and behold, she just got a divorce. I think last December she got a divorce, and I didn't know this because I don't like follow her that intensely. But I saw one of her videos, her lives, where she was talking about her divorce, and I was like, oh shit. And of course, she was literally spinning that again into some kind of funnel for an offering that she has on, I don't even know what it is, some self-empowerment thing. And I was like, girl, like this person was your dream man. You literally got divorced from them like 6 months ago, and something happened. Like there was a shift in her character, and I feel that now she's like totally lost in the persona. And it just speaks to, again, I don't know. Maybe he was an asshole, and good for her if she left an abusive relationship. But even if that was the case, would you really be sitting there talking about it as if it's like such a removed part of your life where it was literally just 6 months ago? Would you be turning that into a paid offering? Would you be profiting off of something that is so deeply traumatic? Unless you were completely caught up and captured and had created this like prison around your life to where you have to do that. You have to commodify every aspect of your life in order to keep up with the storyline that the main character is writing for you. It's almost like you're not even in the driver's seat of it anymore. It's the main character and what the main character says and how the main character interprets events and how the main character looks at things. It's not you anymore. You're detached from that. You're somewhere else. Your soul is like caught in some sort of metaphysical reality that's just like so not embodied. I know this because I've been through it, so I'm speaking from experience. And I'm not saying that my experience is necessarily everybody else's experience, but the themes are so similar. I see myself in these people. That's why I can speak to it, because there's a part of me that has been there. And I'll just say from my experience, when I was there, I was not fulfilled. There were moments, of course, that you're really happy and you're just high on life because, like, again, it's just the ego kind of like using those experiences to boost itself. So what you think is joy and peace and inner freedom from this empowered place is actually just the spiritual super ego, like having an orgasm or something. It's just like this entitlement. It's this ecstatic feeling that comes from that sense of entitlement. So of course there are pockets of joy and liberation in there, But the soul is at unrest. And for me, that manifested as extreme control over my image and my life, to where it was like almost like a neurotic sense of like perfectionism that I had over this curated image, this curated story. Like, oh my gosh, if something did not fit into the storyline, I didn't know what to do with it. And so all the pieces did have to fit. So it was this constant like self-obsession with how I'm going to fit this into the overall narrative. I would like obsess over it. I would go through old journal entries and trying to find these little clues that were going to tie into, why I am where I am now. I mean, it was an imprisonment. It was hell inside my head, and nothing around me was enough to make me feel whole and complete. The only way that I could feel whole and complete was through that external validation that I would get, whether that was money or likes or followers. It was this persona that had just completely taken over my life. And so I don't recommend that. I don't think that there is real peace and truth and harmony in that. And not to mention, it makes for very superficial relationships, because you have to prioritize the story and the character above all else. Paradoxically, you'll have more of a chance in experiencing or achieving, I don't even like to call them achievements, but embodying those things that you want, the inner peace, the joy, the sense of purpose and meaning in your life. You have higher chance of experiencing that when you're not trying to self-improve than when you make self-improvement the goal. Because once you make self-improvement the goal, you're in the ego trap. You're already in it. So just divest from the main character syndrome. This is what I did. I intentionally divested from the main character syndrome, and I started to notice that I don't need to perform for anyone, including my own ego. And it really humbled me. And as a result of that, I gained a lot more empathy towards others. And it really fueled this mission that I have now to liberate others. And so for me, it was a very organic process. And it was a really nice feedback loop, and it feels really validating to be able to talk about it now from this perspective, because I didn't think that any other perspective existed when I was going through that whole process. So wherever you're at in your journey, just know that there's always room for improvement without having to obsess over self-improvement. All you have to do is just shine the light of awareness on these shadow aspects of our social conditioning and how they have contributed to so much discontent and distress and dissatisfaction in your life, and decide that you want to not participate in it. An enormous act of self-care is when you decide that you will no longer pursue self-growth and self-love and self-improvement from this place of survival, and reimagine yourself and your life outside of the frenzy, the commercialized frenzy of capitalism. And it takes a lot of courage, because you really have to stop chasing those external gains and release the need for validation. And I'm not claiming that that's where I'm at with this at all. But I know, I see the path forward, and I know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And that for me is already so peaceful. It's such a peaceful place to be, because I know that I am releasing the need for any kind of external validation through status and popularity and wealth and privilege and likes and all of that, and just disentangling my sense of self from these metrics and choosing my autonomy, my well-being, and my mental health. And that choice is the first initiation towards genuinely loving yourself and genuine self-growth. So with that, I will wrap up today's episode. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me. Like I said, I sometimes feel so gaslit by it all and I question myself, but I know what I know. And when I talk about it and I get feedback and I know that whoever is hearing right now sees me, I feel so seen, and it's very liberating for me, and it's also very healing because it kind of closes this loop for me. Like I said, I've been thinking about this for such a long time. Since 2019, 2020, it's just been percolating in my head. And it really takes a while to integrate it and then, be able to just chop it up, deconstruct it, and then present it through various types of information, written and spoken, and reach people at different capacities at different time points on their journey, because we're all somewhere. So I just thank you for meeting me where I'm at right now, and just know that I'm here to support you. If there's anything that I discussed that you'd like for me to do a deep dive, or you'd like to share your reflections on it, my DMs, my email is always open. I would love to hear how this landed for you. And if you feel that this message that I have is important and would benefit somebody else who's maybe along the process somewhere, who's maybe trying to figure out how to deconstruct from all of this, or disentangle themselves from the self-help loop. I think a lot of people have identified that there is a loop, but it's still unclear how we're going to untangle ourselves from this mess. I'm certainly still at it. I'm still in the thick of it, but we can support each other. So if you feel that this could support someone, this episode, please send it along to them. And I would also really appreciate a review if you like my episodes so far, if you've been listening to my podcast and you believe in with the things that I say, you align with my perspective. I would really appreciate a review. If you're listening on Apple, please leave it on Apple. If it's Spotify, you can review it there, or otherwise you can just email me. I would be so honored to feature your review on my website. I would really love to break down self-help books, popular self-help books. That was something that was requested, and I love that idea. So maybe the next season of my podcast, I will choose a book and major ideas and kind of do deep dives in that way. So if you have any book recommendations, just let me know, and I'll make sure to add it to the debunk list on my notes in my iPhone. Oh, and then just one more reminder is that September is going to be the last month that I'm going to be doing one-on-one mentorships. I'm not sure if I even mentioned that on this podcast, but yes, I do offer one-on-one mentorships. My rate is $65 for 45 minutes, but you get a little discount for a package of 4. I'm saying this because people have asked to work with me, and September is the last time that I'm going to be offering this until the spring, because during the winter I go through my incubation phase and I just go inwards and do my writing and reflecting in the winter and the fall and winter months. So if you've been wanting to work with me one-on-one, now would be the time until April of next year. And in my one-on-one sessions, I specialize in helping people develop self-awareness and doing this kind of ego work that is really required for a healthy and strong ego to be able to navigate these challenges without internalizing a bunch of toxic messages, whether that is through developing critical thinking skills or emotional resiliency skills or communication skills, or just to feel a little bit more present, a little bit more grounded, less reactive in your life. Some people book sessions with me just to have some philosophical discussions or process something that they read on social media, and that's totally fine too. You can learn more about my mentorship style on my website. And if you would like to support the podcast and support me, please consider buying the ebook. This is a very useful tool. If you're listening to this podcast and you've been following my work, I will say that you probably have some familiarity and mastery over the concepts that I discuss in the ebook. So maybe it's not really going to be useful for you right now, just being honest, because I know where my audience is at and where my listeners are at. And it's a very advanced and intelligent group. So maybe the ebook is not your go-to resource right now, although no matter what, you will learn something because there's so much research in there. It would just be a really great way to support me as one of your dedicated creators. It's very meaningful to me as an author, a creator. I'm sure many people listening to this can relate to that because I have so many creators in my audience. So, when your audience sends you any kind of messages of appreciation and any token of appreciation, it is just so meaningful, and it just keeps inspiring high quality content that matters. I will see you next time. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast, and if you share it on social media, don't forget to tag me at Seek with Sarah. For my ebooks, courses, or to work with me one-on-one, visit my website, seekwithsarah.com. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Thanks for pressing play. See you next time.